On June 22, 2025, a date that would forever be etched in the annals of history, the world was jolted awake, the hum of daily life replaced by a deafening silence as people grappled with the unfolding events. News broke of a massive U.S. military operation against Iran, a move that sent shockwaves across the globe. The United States launched a sweeping series of airstrikes, a calculated and forceful display of military might, targeting Iran's most fortified nuclear facilities, the heart of their controversial nuclear ambitions: Fordow, Natanz, and Esfahan. These were not just buildings, they were symbols of a nation's aspirations and fears. Codenamed Midnight Hammer, a name that suggested both precision and power, the operation marked a dramatic escalation, a point of no return in a long and troubled relationship. In U.S.-Iran tensions, a relationship fraught with mistrust and simmering animosity, shattering years of uneasy diplomacy, years of painstaking negotiations and fragile agreements now reduced to ashes. Over 125 aircraft, a formidable armada of aerial power, including B-2 stealth bombers, the silent specters of the sky, delivered 75 precision-guided munitions, each one carrying the weight of geopolitical strategy, focusing on deeply buried sites, those facilities designed to withstand conventional attacks. The Fordow facility, carved into a mountain, a testament to human ingenuity and the desire for security, was hit with bunker-buster bombs, weapons designed to penetrate even the most fortified defenses, signaling this was no warning shot. This was not a mere gesture of disapproval. It was a direct attempt to cripple Iran's nuclear program for years, setting back their ambitions and altering the balance of power in the region. The world and Iran were caught off guard. The element of surprise was a key component of the operation. The night sky lit up with explosions, a terrifying spectacle of destruction and a stark reminder of the consequences of geopolitical tensions. As the strikes unfolded, a relentless barrage of firepower reshaping the landscape and the future. In the aftermath, confusion reigned, a fog of uncertainty obscuring the path forward. News trickled out, fragmented and incomplete, followed by official statements carefully crafted to manage the narrative and shape public opinion, and satellite images revealing the devastation, stark evidence of the scale and impact of the attack. The U.S. quickly claimed responsibility, standing firm in the face of international scrutiny, framing the attack as a necessary step, a difficult but unavoidable decision, to prevent a nuclear-armed Iran, a scenario they deemed an unacceptable threat to global security. Iran responded with outrage, their leaders vowing revenge and condemning the attack in the strongest possible terms, condemning the strikes as criminal aggression, a violation of international law and a blatant act of hostility. The fragile framework of diplomacy was obliterated, the last vestiges of hope for a peaceful resolution extinguished, replaced by the stark reality of open conflict, a dangerous and unpredictable path forward. The Middle East, already volatile, a tinderbox of sectarian tensions and geopolitical rivalries, now faced a new and unpredictable chapter, one filled with peril and uncertainty. The world watched, holding its breath, as the consequences of this bold move began to unfold, sending ripples across the international stage. The question was no longer if conflict would erupt. The die had been cast, but how far it would spread, and what devastating consequences would follow. The era of uneasy peace was over. The fragile balance had been shattered beyond repair. A new, dangerous phase had begun, ushering in an era of heightened tensions and the looming threat of wider conflict. In Washington, officials hailed Operation Midnight Hammer as a flawless display of American power, a testament to its technological prowess and strategic planning. 7 B-2 stealth bombers led the assault, the spearhead of a meticulously planned operation, evading Iran's sophisticated air defenses, a feat of engineering and tactical execution, and striking with pinpoint accuracy, minimizing collateral damage while maximizing impact. 14 bunker-buster bombs were used, specifically designed to penetrate deep underground facilities, to destroy Iran's most secure nuclear sites, dealing a significant blow to their nuclear program, sending a clear message: no target is safe from American might. President Trump addressed the nation in a televised broadcast from the Oval Office, declaring the strikes a spectacular success, a victory for American security and global stability, and insisting they were a necessary action, a preemptive measure to prevent a nuclear-armed Iran, to ensure global security and protect allies in the region. The administration framed the operation as a one-time limited strike, carefully calibrated to achieve specific objectives, meant to cripple Iran's nuclear ambitions, setting back their program by years. Not start a war, but to prevent one. Behind the scenes, the strategy was to force Iran back to negotiations under renewed international pressure, but this time from a position of weakness, with their nuclear capabilities significantly diminished. The Pentagon made it clear further strikes could follow should Iran resume its nuclear activities. If Iran did not change course and adhere to international norms, the U.S. gambled that overwhelming force, a clear demonstration of its military might, would succeed where diplomacy had failed, breaking the stalemate and paving the way for a new agreement. The world was left to wonder, anxiously awaiting Iran's next move. If this show of strength would bring peace, a lasting resolution to the nuclear issue, or ignite a wider conflict, plunging the region into further instability. The operation was as much about altering Iran's political calculus, forcing them to reassess their strategic priorities, as it was about destroying physical infrastructure, sending a message that defiance has consequences. The message the U.S. would not tolerate a nuclear Iran, a red line that could not be crossed, and was willing to act decisively, even unilaterally, to prevent it. The stakes had never been higher, with the potential for escalation looming large. The future of the region, its stability, its security, its very existence, and the world, its fragile peace, its interconnected economies, now hung in the balance, teetering on the edge of uncertainty. The world braced for Iran's response, a response that would determine the course of history. The U.S. government defended the strikes as a necessary and preemptive move, asserting that inaction would have had far graver consequences. The stated goal was to halt Iran's progress towards reaching a nuclear point of no return, a threshold beyond which reversing course would become virtually impossible. Officials claimed they possessed credible intelligence, gathered through various sources, which showed Iran was rapidly approaching a nuclear weapons breakthrough, significantly shortening the timeline previously estimated. This intelligence, they argued, made military action unavoidable in order to prevent a catastrophic outcome. The White House further argued that years of painstaking diplomacy had ultimately failed to curb Iran's nuclear ambitions, and that Iran's repeated violations of past agreements demonstrated a clear lack of commitment to peaceful resolutions. Given these circumstances, the administration concluded that all other options had been exhausted, leaving no other viable path forward. Therefore, the strikes were presented to the public and the international community as a carefully considered last resort, designed to neutralize an imminent threat to regional and global security. The hope was to significantly degrade Iran's nuclear capabilities and force its leadership to reconsider its current trajectory. The administration was quick to insist that regime change in Iran was not the ultimate goal of these actions, but rather a fundamental change in the regime's behavior regarding its nuclear program and regional activities. By directly targeting Iran's prized nuclear program and its associated infrastructure, Washington aimed to send a clear and unequivocal message to Tehran and the rest of the world that further aggression, particularly in the pursuit of nuclear weapons, would not be tolerated and would be met with a decisive response. President Trump, in a televised address, directly urged Iran to permanently abandon its nuclear ambitions, and even hinted at the possibility of returning to the negotiating table to forge a new, more comprehensive and tougher deal, but only if Iran fundamentally changed course and demonstrated a genuine commitment to peaceful solutions. The underlying hope was that crippling Iran's nuclear program through these targeted strikes would ultimately create the necessary leverage to bring Iran back to the negotiating table for future diplomatic negotiations. However, this strategy was predicated on the assumption that Iran would ultimately yield to the mounting pressure and choose de-escalation over further escalating the already volatile conflict in the region. As the dust settled, the entire world watched with bated breath to see whether this high-stakes gamble would ultimately pay off and lead to a more peaceful resolution, or whether it would tragically backfire, plunging the region into deeper turmoil. Iran's response was swift and furious. President Pezeshkian appeared on state TV, condemning the U.S. as the main source of regional instability and vowing retaliation. Foreign Minister Araghchi called the strikes a blatant violation of international law and the UN Charter, warning the world of the chaos unleashed by Washington. The attack united a divided nation, with state media broadcasting images of defiant citizens and patriotic songs. The Revolutionary Guard Corps promised a crushing response, framing the conflict as a fight for Iran's sovereignty and dignity. Officials claimed sensitive nuclear materials had been relocated before the attack, downplaying the long-term impact. Iran projected resilience, insisting it would rebuild and continue its nuclear program. The regime's message: Iran was under siege but unbroken. The world watched as Iran's leaders promised to strike back. The sense of crisis deepened. The stage was set for escalation. Iran declared diplomacy dead and vowed severe retaliation. Foreign Minister Araghchi announced that talks with the U.S. were off the table, accusing Washington of destroying any trust. Iranian leaders, from hardliners to moderates, promised the U.S. attack would have far-reaching consequences. Tehran appealed to the UN, seeking to isolate the U.S. and rally global support. Meanwhile, Iran's military and proxy forces were placed on high alert, preparing for asymmetric responses. The world braced for Iran's next move, knowing retaliation was not a question of if, but when and how. The region teetered on the edge of a wider conflict. The global reaction was swift and somber. UN Secretary-General Guterres called the strikes a dire threat to peace, urging restraint and a return to dialogue. European leaders, caught off guard, condemned the escalation and warned that hopes for diplomacy were shattered. China and Russia denounced the U.S. action as a violation of international law and Iran's sovereignty, deepening geopolitical divides. Across the world, nations voiced fears of a broader conflict and disruption to global energy supplies. Even U.S. allies like Saudi Arabia and Chile criticized the strikes, highlighting the widespread unease. The prevailing sentiment: this single act could ignite a regional war with global consequences. The collapse of diplomacy left the world anxious and uncertain. Calls for calm grew louder, but the path to peace seemed more distant than ever. The world held its breath, fearing what might come next. Israel was the lone voice of unequivocal support, praising the U.S. for decisive action against Iran. Israeli forces launched their own strikes on Iranian government and military sites, escalating the crisis and targeting the regime's power centers. The U.S. and Israel presented a united front, but their actions risked triggering a direct, all-out war. Russia and China condemned both nations, positioning themselves as defenders of Iran and challengers to U.S. influence in the region. Europe, meanwhile, called for de-escalation, but found itself sidelined as military conflict overtook diplomacy. The crisis exposed the limits of European influence and the deepening rift between global powers. The anti-Iran alliance hardened, while the opposing bloc rallied to Tehran's side. The Middle East became the stage for a new era of great power rivalry. The world order was shifting before everyone's eyes. With its nuclear program in ruins, Iran faced a critical choice: how to respond without risking regime survival. One option: disrupt global oil trade by threatening the Strait of Hormuz, risking a major international military response. Another: unleash proxy forces like Hezbollah and the Houthis to attack U.S. and Israeli interests across the region. Iran could also target U.S. bases or ships directly, risking all-out war. Covert attacks or cyber operations against American or Israeli targets were also possible. Some experts warned Iran might even attempt a desperate dash for a nuclear weapon, despite the damage. Each option carried grave risks for Iran and the world. The regime's next move would shape the future of the Middle East. The world waited, anxious and uncertain. The U.S. strikes on Iran shattered the diplomatic framework that once kept conflict in check. With diplomacy dead, the risk of war loomed larger than ever. The world was split, the U.S. and Israel on one side, Russia and China on the other, with Europe powerless to mediate. The fear of a full-blown regional war grew, with the potential for catastrophic humanitarian and economic consequences. Disruption of oil shipments could trigger a global recession, affecting millions far from the conflict zone. The hope for a peaceful solution to Iran's nuclear ambitions faded into memory. Now, every misstep risked igniting a wider conflagration. The future was uncertain, marked by tension and military posturing. The quest for security through force had made the world less secure. The world braced for what might come next, knowing the stakes had never been higher.